So very warm welcome to our event today I'm Vanessa from the Equality Trust, and we're very pleased to be joining today with Academics Stand Against Poverty UK, which Lee will be speaking about a bit more shortly. So a couple of practicalities. We're going to start with some presentations today. We'll have 4 speakers, each sharing some of their research to give context to the socio-economic duty and how it's a chance to challenge policies that cause social harm. We'll also then have some time for the final, so about half an hour for some Q&A. So if you do have any questions or thoughts during the session, please do add those on the chat, or you can also ask a little bit later on the mic by unmuting as well. But it would be helpful if during the talks, if people could have the mute on, just so we don't get sort of background noise or interference whilst others are speaking, would be really helpful. So we've got some great speakers for you today to explore this socio-economic duty. It's the subject of my research over the last 2 years, looking at its uncommenced status in England, though of course Scotland and Wales have already activated the duty, and we'll be hearing a bit about the experience in Wales from Dave a little bit later. But to start our event, I think it's always really useful to think about the context of why addressing socioeconomic inequalities is such a pressing issue for us in the current context. And it's a delight to have with us today Richard Wilkinson, who's one of our co-patrons and of course co-author of The Spirit Level, which was a publication that was very much informing the discourse in 2009 and 2010 when the socioeconomic duty was developed. So it really informed this piece of law that can make a difference. I'm sure Richard needs no further introduction. His work speaks for itself. So I'd like to invite Richard to take us onwards, considering particularly some of the update with the Spirit Level at 15 years on from the original piece of work. Thank you, Richard, for being with us today.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's really nice to be with you and to see quite a number of old friends tuned in today. It's such a long time since the Spirit Level that I'm increasingly aware that a great many people have not come across it. So let me just outline how I got into recognizing how important inequality is. We looked at inequality in rich developed countries, and when I say inequality, I mean income differences between rich and poor, and related that to a number of outcomes, to health, to child well-being, to the proportion of population in prison, to levels of violence, to social cohesion, how much people feel they can trust others in society. And what we saw were quite striking relationships, showing that the more unequal a society is, the worse all these things get. And sometimes very big differences between how more unequal societies perform and the more equal ones. When I say that, I mean not just 10 or 20% differences in how much violence, but sometimes on some analyses that other people have done around the world, as much as 10 times as much, huge differences. Now, the reason for that, I think, is that inequality, in a sense, is a social relationship. What it does is put us all in a sort of hierarchy. We're all ordered as if from best to worst, and it's that idea that makes inequality hurt, those feelings of inferiority and so on. And there are now good papers showing that anxiety about how you're seen and judged by other people increases with inequality, not just amongst the poor, but right across the population. We all become more worried about how people think about us. And increasingly, it looks as if, and one of the big changes in our understanding of, for instance, health over the decades from research, again, around the world, is the importance of psychosocial factors working through chronic stress. And it's these pathways that affect all the kinds of outcomes I just mentioned. Um, and those worries about status, about what other people think of you, your feelings that you have to sort of prepare to be seen, people check in the mirror, or they worry if they're going to, at a party, um, people are going to think they're stupid or unattractive or boring. All those kinds of things seem to get worse as you look at more unequal countries, or as countries become more unequal. And we get onto that more psychological side, those pathways, in our later book, The Spirit Level. Sorry, the Inner Level. As my Christmas present, Kate Pickett, my wife and co-author, gave me an update of all the data in the Spirit Level 15 years later, which the Equality Trust has turned into a very nice update pamphlet, which many of you have seen, showing basically 15 years later, these relationships are just the same. Anyway, one of the big changes that shows that inequality is even more important than I think we had initially recognized is it now looks as if it's a precondition for moving towards sustainability. Increasingly, people are saying instead of economic growth, we want to pursue sustainable well-being, and inequality through those pathways affects well-being. It's probably the most important stressor across the whole population. You get the worst sources of stress, losing your house or losing your job. But fortunately, most of us don't suffer those things. But we all have these worries about how we're seen and judged. And across the population as a whole, these sorts of worries about how you're judged in this social hierarchy, and the belief that people are of different values. Some people are worth much more than others, some people are better than others, and so on, all strengthened by inequality. But when you look at the footprint of the rich compared to the poor, it's very clear that we can't get to sustainability without dealing with the huge consumption and footprint of the rich. And Oxfam says the richest 1% of the global population are responsible for more emissions than the poorest 66% of the world's population. Or the richest 10% account for nearly half the emissions of the global population. And so we have to do something about that consumption at the top, not only because it's so large, but because people will not accept green taxes, environmental measures, if it's seen as unfair, if people at the top are not dealt with. Their consumption isn't pulled down. And we saw that in the Gilets jaunes protests in France, which forced Macron to withdraw proposals for raising taxes on fuel. Protests all over France that lasted several years were basically about it being unfair. So if we're going to get to sustainability, not only if we're going to get closer to well-being, reduce all the problems I mentioned in the beginning, we have to deal with inequality. And this meeting today is really exciting because it feels like the first real progress. And we've had statesmen, political leaders mentioning inequality, but no real progress. And this, the socio-economic duty, I think in Wales and Scotland, not only has it made a difference to policy, but I think it forces people to think continuously about it in all their measures. It raises the profile of inequality, it brings it into the center of political attention and policy making. And so for me, it does seem really exciting that perhaps Britain is going to, or England is going to enforce that in future and pass this, so put it into effect, the socio-economic duty. So I think I'm going to stop there. I'm really keen to hear what other people have got to say and also what people listening to this have to contribute. So thank you, and I hope you share my excitement at this and see it perhaps as the beginning of real action on inequality in the future, improving the real quality of our lives and making it a little bit easier to move towards sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to have you with us. And I think the journey and the influence at the spirit level, a book that I'm sure is on many of our bookshelves and has informed our work in this area as either social justice academics and or activists. So thank you so much to both you and Kate as our co-patrons and for giving us that fantastic body of work and research to inform our work, and which of course informed the development of the socio-economic duty back in 2010. And of course, this socio-economic duty will require all governments and local authorities to consider how, when they're setting policies and strategies, how they can reduce those inequalities of opportunity and socio-economic rich-poor gap and access to resources being unequal, as we see, and topical issues like rising child poverty, so pertinent to our work and urgent contemporary issues. And so before we dive deeper into the detail of that duty, its potential, its meaning, and how we can all contribute to the call for evidence, we're going to hear a little bit more from two other researchers. The first is Lee Gregory, who is Associate Professor of Social Policy at the University of Nottingham and Chair of Academic Stand Against Poverty UK. We're delighted to partner with for this event today to share more context on topical research and thoughts about some hopes perhaps on how we'd like to see this duty implemented to be effective. Lee, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I'm just going to give a slight jump scare warning. There's a tiny little spider walking around the top of my screen. If he crawls onto my camera, you might get a very close-up view. So just keep an eye out for that. As Vanessa said, I am also chair of Academic Stand Against Poverty UK. So ASAP UK is a chapter of the global Academic Stand Against Poverty network, which was established in the US some years ago now. And I think the UK chapter, I probably should double check this, but I think around 2013 or early sort of 2010s is when we were established. ASAP UK is primarily focused on drawing together evidence and insight from academics across the UK and beyond to address a variety of issues regarding poverty. One key thing we have been doing since 2015 has been our manifesto audits. So in 2015, 2017, and 2024, we've conducted a series of reviews of various manifestos in the build-up to elections to provide people with some material, some insight into how the manifestos measure up to tackling poverty. I've just popped a link in the chat where you can go to the most recent version of that report from 2014, that audit, and there's a link in there to archives for the 2015, 2017, but also to our methodology, our narrative around poverty, and how that shapes our analysis. And the reason I mention that, not only to promote obviously what ASAP UK has been doing, but I also do it to highlight how, in a roundabout way, it is a potential way in which we've started to consider that issue of poverty, which could be relevant for the socio-economic duty. So I just wanted to briefly mention a few insights from a chapter, so it's a bit of publication plug in here, a chapter based on the 3 manifesto audits that I've written with one of our other trustees, which gets published this month, I believe, in Social Policy Review, which sort of indicates some learning, some insights from that sort of 3 reviews, essentially. So what we've seen essentially is, despite shifts in which manifestos have been covered, because it all depends on how quickly political parties actually publish their manifestos and the tight timeline of conducting the audit, and it's safe to say political parties seem reluctant to publish manifestos too early. What we've started to see is essentially a decreasing or very low level of ambition within manifestos to effectively address poverty and to tackle poverty within the framework we've established at ASAP UK around sort of human flourishing and well-being. Like I said, you can go to the link I popped into the chat. It can take you to the methodology and narrative for more detail. Whilst we don't advocate for any, for voting for any particular party, we don't advocate on behalf of any political party. We are an independent charity, interested in bringing, like I said, academics and research together about how we can tackle poverty. What we have been able to see over those 3 audits essentially is a very clear pattern where the Conservative Party, UKIP, stroke Reform, same leader, so we might as well lump them in the same group, have tended to score quite low on their efforts to tackle poverty in their manifestos, whereas the Greens and Lib Dems generally tend to be the upper end of the parties we've analysed. Plaid Cymru, we've covered a few times. SNP, they've never released their manifestos in time for us to actually include them in the analysis. The interesting one, however, is the Labour Party, and that's perhaps relevant considering it's their manifesto, which is suggesting they're going to enact this socio-economic duty. And essentially, it's potentially seen as a slightly depressing development for the Labour Party, in that their 2015 election manifesto scored reasonably well, but not particularly high. And there was perhaps a disparity between what Ed Miliband was potentially saying around then, drawing upon the spirit level, and what then made its way into the manifesto. In 2017, Labour scored incredibly high on their efforts to tackle poverty within their manifesto, and that dropped again to the lower levels in 2024. So we've seen how leadership variations have basically changed within the Labour Party, their ambitions to try and tackle poverty. However, it's important to highlight that none of the manifestos score particularly high on the overall scale. So on a scale of 1 to 5, they're all typically below 4. Reform, UKIP have been at the lower end of that. Other parties have been around the 2 to sort of 3 to high 3.456 or so. I'd like to also just add in here, thank you, because I know a couple of our auditors are on the call today. So thank you to all the auditors, our academic auditors, and the anonymous reviewers of those audits turn this round incredibly quickly. I think it's literally like a 10-day turnaround once we work it out backwards from publication dates, basically. So with that context in mind, I just wanted to think about the socio-economic duty and the consultation, which Vanessa's going to pick up in a bit more detail in a moment, and just set out a few key reflections, if you like, about the, I won't say ASAP position, but broader, I guess, ASAP sort of interest in this activation of the duty. And a couple of these reflections do just generate from ideas that I've been thinking in relation to this and preparing for this meeting today. I think it's also important to highlight how typically when we talk about socioeconomic inequality and disadvantage, it's primarily focused on distributive aspects. So the development of the welfare state in particular has been important in its role in addressing some of those distributive aspects. which makes the socio-economic duty slightly different from other parts of the Equality 2010 Act, which are perhaps a bit more focused on status and rights-based claims and anti-discrimination legislation. However, many people, and I've recognized a lot of the names in the participants today, people who've been studying welfare state development much longer than I've been within the discipline of social policy, will know that, particularly since the 1980s, the position of the welfare state, the narratives around the welfare state, the provision through the welfare states in the UK has radically changed and moved more towards residualization in how it's particularly around social security provision, but also changes in relation to how welfare is envisaged, how it's discussed in the media and within political debate. So within the 2010 Equality Act, we've potentially got this mixture then of redistribution and perhaps recognition aspects. And that's not necessarily problematic. There's significant work like Nancy Fraser's, which has illustrated the need to integrate that redistribution and recognition is a useful way of considering those interconnections and the importance they have for efforts to tackle inequality. And I think one thing that I'd be encouraging people to consider submitting to the consultation, and that's how I want to position a lot of my comments, is encouraging all of you as participants, as well as anyone who watches this recording later, to consider contributing to this consultation. I think one of the important aspects to consider is the intersectional and how the socio-economic interrelates to other already protected characteristics. Yesterday, I was given a presentation on some research I've completed with colleagues at Stirling. I think Peter's probably on the call. I saw his name in the participants a moment ago, and Sheffield Hallam, where we've looked at LGBTQ+ access to welfare, assets and debts in Great Britain, and we've highlighted some of the ways in which issues of poverty, precariety, financial difficulties impact on that LGBTQ+ community, and the importance of that when trying to tackle myths like the pink pound. So I was presenting some of this yesterday at an event at Aston University. So one thing I'd be encouraging submissions to focus on is not just about the importance of socio-economic duty itself, but how it relates to other intersectional identities and protected characteristics, to find fruitful ways of ensuring that we don't just play off the importance of different characteristics. And I think that's really important because the duty is about, or it's focused on, strategic review, strategic decision making. So there are ways in which an analysis around socioeconomic duty can be downplayed slightly if other impacts are going to have benefits for other parts of the decision making process, whether that's around protected characteristics, fiscal challenges that bodies are having to decide around. So I feel like trying to highlight the importance of, I'll just keep hammering this point a bit at the moment, those intersectional aspects, and that we cannot just see socioeconomic as being distinct from gender, as being distinct from ethnicity. I think we've got decades of research which highlight the complex ways in which gender and ethnicity, for example, intersect with each other. COVID-19 highlighted that quite effectively, if depressingly, in relation to ethnicity. We have decades of research in relationships between household incomes and gender, the feminization of poverty debates. We can see that socioeconomic status plays out in different ways around whether you're male or female. Leaving aside trans people, non-binary people, where we know very, very little about their sort of household financial situations and socioeconomic circumstances. I think another challenge which I would be encouraging people to contribute to in relation to the consultation is how we actually think about measurement and definitions, how we actually start to develop suitable ways, lenses, if you like, through which bodies can consider socioeconomic status. There's some literature which has argued that broader social exclusion frameworks may be useful. I'd probably also point to the now defunct Child Poverty Act 2010, which highlighted ways in which several measures of poverty were integrated into law. And they had that legal status, that, that clear definition of, how poverty levels amongst children in 2020 were going to be measured, against which progress was to be made. So contributions, I think, to the consultation around measurement issues, around thinking about how we can develop them consistently across different decision-making bodies is going to be fundamentally important to having some effective impact of the socio-economic duty. If different authorities, if different bodies use different measures, then it becomes much harder and much more problematic to consider the impact of policy decisions on socioeconomic status. I think what's related to that, and this is just a sort of side thought, but maybe a worrying side thought I had in preparing for today, was thinking about the different ways in which poverty has been framed and the challenges that that presents. It links into what Richard was saying right at the beginning about the psychosocial factors. Poverty debates increasingly and historically have focused on issues of stigma, deserving and undeserving, individualized behavioral explanations, especially in that post-80s period, where again, the data shows that increase in levels of inequality in the UK. So consultation documents, the debate around the socioeconomic duty has to find ways of tackling that stigmatizing narrative, which is prevalent in quite often any form of intervention to tackle poverty, and thinking about how we can start to reframe that debate to generate a less stigmatizing, less problematic narrative around poverty, around socioeconomic status, which then helps, I hope would help with tackling those status anxiety, those psychosocial harms which result from much of this inequality. So changing the narrative, as has to be a key part of implementing the socioeconomic duty. I think we also need to, one interesting thing about the duty as well is there's been a bit of encouragement not to generate new evidence, but to use the existing evidence. So again, there's going to be differences in measures of poverty and so forth. But we have decades of research, particularly with the Spirit level, which shows us the consequence of inequality in relation to socioeconomic status in particular. So perhaps, hopefully, despite their sort of poor performance in the manifesto audit, there is some political will within the Labour Party to not only enact this duty, but to do so in a way which hopefully would start to point towards and prioritize the importance of structural changes and not buying into perpetuating the sort of more individualized explanations which have dominated the sort of policy-making scene for quite some time now. I think to finish then, because I'm just keeping an eye on time and I'm almost out of my time now, I'd like to just point to some strengths, I think, which exist, which could be emphasized through submissions to the consultation. I think promoting that holistic approach around the intersections, intersectionality, the relationship between socioeconomic factors and other protected characteristics to encourage a systematic challenge and change to the sources of inequality is something which many people in this chat are going to be able to contribute to, and I would encourage you to do so. To encourage policy designs then, which are preemptive in their mitigations towards socioeconomic disparities rather than reactive to those inequalities. I hate the word disparities, I can't believe I just said that, but inequalities. But also looking at ways around empowering communities. And again, there's lots of research which is trying to promote the voice of poor people, but also different socioeconomic disadvantaged groups to get that into policy-making processes. So ways in which we can encourage that, I think, should also be fed into the consultation.
Thank you, Lee. It was great to have you giving us that, setting the scenery and the opportunity for us all to mobilise our research on this call for evidence. So thank you for encouraging us all to share the research we have. And it's so important to say that even if you haven't got research specifically on the socio-economic duty, as you'll see later, adjacent research on these wider inequalities that both Richard and Lee have been touching on so far would be very valuable, both to us at the Equality Trust. We'd be very interested to share knowledge, but also for this government consultation, which we'll go into a little bit more detail shortly. But next, we're going to hear from Dave Beck, who is lecturer in social policy at the University of Salford and has published research particularly around themes of food poverty and insecurity and universal basic income, and also can share the experience in Wales where the socio-economic duty has been commenced. So it'd be really interesting to hear your insights, Dave. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, so when the Equality Act 2010, as Lee's just outlined really nicely, when it was enacted, the socio-economic duty part of it remained inactive, but on the statute book, because the UK government chose not to implement it. However, following the Wales Act 2017 and a new model of Welsh devolution, it granted Welsh ministers the authority to actually enact this duty in Wales, and it became a legal obligation for all public bodies, by March 2021. So what this meant really for us was, that public bodies here had a duty to ensure that, their decisions and the processes by which they arrived at all the decisions that they make that affect the public didn't negate to consider how these decisions affected people's lives and people who suffer from socioeconomic disadvantage, and importantly, not now nor in the future as well. So those decisions they've got to have a positive impact on people's lives, and really what we see is that this is achieved across these several interconnected categories where socioeconomic disadvantage can maybe be experienced by both people in communities of interest, but also communities of place as well. But as we know, interests and identity markers and the things that makes you, I think we recognize that they can be experienced across both space and place as well, and personality, and at times, they can lead to multiple experiences of inequalities of outcome, via socioeconomic disadvantage, and maybe the social scientists amongst us, you'll associate this with, as Lee mentioned, issues of intersectionality. So I want to just give a little bit of background to the problems that Wales experiences. And for me, as a researcher, I've lived in poverty, and to a certain extent, I still live in relative poverty. Now, I'm from a very working class background. I used to be a bricklayer, been laid off several times as a builder post-recession 2008. So I've spent a lifetime, in poverty, and now as I've got a very privileged position as an academic to look at it, from more of an objective level, but I still have that subjective feeling. So I'm really interested in understanding how poverty shapes people's lives, and that led to my PhD, which I completed at Bangor University in 2018. So I think Wales, we've got like an intractable problem really of poverty and social disadvantage. From my academic, I'm also a geographer. I work in social policy, but my background really is in geography. So I like to understand maps and I like to map social policy issues. So I'm interested in understanding people's lived experience of poverty across multiple geographies of space and place. And for example, we know that like the vast majority of Wales, is categorized as rural. Maybe 20% of it or so is categorized as urban. But within these urban spaces is where we find the vast majority of our households, whether this is, maybe in the big cities of Cardiff or Swansea, Newport, or in the more peri-urban areas where I live. I live in Bangor, the North Wales coastline, or in Ynys Môn, Anglesey. But across these rural and urban areas, working poverty for some time has hovered around the 1 in 5 mark of the Welsh population. But overall, poverty rates tends to sit at around about, quite stubbornly, 25 to 23 to 25%, which is the highest for all UK nations. Now, we also know that rural deprivation is a significant, but also sometimes a hidden problem, and we also know that poverties and indices of deprivation do go hand in hand. And we can tentatively map, for example, here, like I've done, rural spaces, and with the 2040, this is from my PhD. There has been a 2019 update, but with the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. So when we look at this through, for example, my research from my PhD, which was on the rise of food banks across Wales, we can see that these maps and the locations of food banks, as we can see here, across what are identified as indices, areas of multiple deprivation, across the North Wales coastline, or also across the South Wales valleys. And it's striking. We've got more food banks across the UK than McDonald's outlets, and in one of our most deprived areas of North Wales, Rhyl West, there are more food banks than there are supermarkets. Which when we think about the rise of poverty, the rise of food insecurity post-recession, 2009 recession, we can see that these food banks become quite endemic. And what we know from research that's across the US and across Canada, and work that colleagues of mine have been involved in, once we let the food bank genie out of the bottle, you can't get it back in. Once food banks are there, established within the community, they become part of the established community, and they become part of the system of social, external social security. So I think, as others have discussed, Lee and Richard have discussed this morning, the purpose of the duty is to reduce inequalities, inequalities of outcome, which result from levels of socio-economic disadvantage. Now, in Wales, this has seen, a focus on ensuring that strategic decisions are made with consideration to the impact of the socio-economic inequality across both communities of interest, but also communities of place as well. So the duty provides this kind of unique opportunity for Cymru to approach, how it makes decisions differently, in a way that respects people's socio-disadvantage, a socio-economic disadvantage, and by placing the reduction of inequality at the core of how Wales and the public bodies within Wales make strategic decisions, I think we can see that the duty would then, it does ensure that economic considerations and human rights become prioritized. So this is really significant in context of our position now outside of the European Union, because Wales historically has benefited from significant amounts of money through EU structural funds that aimed at supporting some of the poorer communities across Wales. So I think the duty here has been, it serves as kind of a strategic, like a strategic way of fostering inclusive growth, of helping Wales to be able to hopefully, start to lift people out of poverty. And I think maybe for those who are not aware, those who are outside of Wales and are not aware, we've got, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015, and for the researchers in Wales, this is quite, and for policymakers in Wales, it's a groundbreaking piece of legislation that aims to improve the social, economic, environmental, the cultural well-being of Wales, and we can kind of see reflections of the socio-economic duty when we think about the Future Gen Act. The future, it places, for example, legal duties on public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impacts of decisions that they make, whether this is about, as we can see around the clock here, whether this is about people and communities, and how it does it in an integrated approach across these 7 goals, which really speak to a prosperous, resilient, healthier, a more equal Wales, one that has got cohesive communities and a vibrant culture and a thriving Welsh language. And that also Wales can do this externally by looking to the global community and being globally responsible. And we hopefully adopt this and the duty through sustainable development approach, really, under the identity of well-being of future generations. So this involves kind of setting and publishing well-being objectives that align with the Act's well-being goals as well. And public bodies must take responsible steps to achieve these goals. And that is really part of how the Future Generations Act works. And so we can see how it really fits together with the idea of enacting the socio-economic duty. And I think it was just the next logical step was, for Wales to enact the duty anyway. So just to finish, I wanted to bring an example of, the application of the duty across Wales. The Welsh government, for example, it allocated an additional £10 million to support social care workers through, an enhancement of the statutory sick pay. And this funding was aimed at ensuring that care workers could receive their full pay during COVID-19, rather than just a statutory sick pay. And what this did was it provided financial support to approximately 18,000 full-time equivalent care workers, those who we recognise as being potentially most vulnerable, during COVID. Many of these, were employed in private sector, who we know is quite notorious for low pay, minimum wage pay, people who are really, really vulnerable to losing parts of their income and possibly having a detrimental impact on not only their health, but also their socio-economic health as well. So the majority of care workers, it's reflective of maybe the demographic composition of those who do work in the social care sector, where women make up, a large proportion of the workforce. And many of these women, or many of the care workers, they needed an enhancement to their statutory sick pay, and this is exactly what the socio-economic duty wanted to encourage and wanted to make sure that it could respect and reflect the poverty, wages, and the loss of income that people really, really would have struggled throughout COVID. So the scheme, it really did address several areas of the socio-economic duty, and I think it reflected both, for example, communities of interest for low pay, but also reflected, communities of place as well. And it reduced financial inequality, for low-paid workers. It supported the well-being of a predominantly female workforce and ensured socioeconomic considerations were kind of integrated into public health and social care policies. So I just want to finish with what I think and where I would like to see this go next. So I'm a resident of Wales, but I do work at the University of Salford in Greater Manchester. So I get to kind of see the benefits of what a really integrated transport system could look like. And I've just been reading about the development of the B network and how that fits really well with the socio-economic duty in Greater Manchester. And for somebody who works in Manchester, I can buy a bus ticket from one side of Manchester and probably get to the other side of Manchester at a very, very, very low cost, something like £2. That's kind of the baseline of the cost of a bus in Greater Manchester. So, but living in Wales, I'd like to see really something really, really similar, maybe an integrated transport system that could help to lift people out of poverty in Wales and really connect with the idea of a lived experience of how to reduce socioeconomic deprivation. I'd love to be able to get a train, for example, from where I live in Bangor all the way to Cardiff without having to leave Wales to go to change at Chester, change at Crewe, change at Shrewsbury, to come back into Wales to go to Cardiff. I think having a nice integrated transport that connects both North and South Wales with East and West Wales would really, really help us realise the power of the socio-economic duty. Wales has got a population of 3 million, so does Greater Manchester. And I understand as a geographer, there is the geographical differences in concentrations of where people live, but it would be nice to have something that kind of reflects this as well for us in Wales. Okay, diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. That's really interesting to learn from your experience in Wales and with your experience, of course, living in Wales, but also working in England, comparing perhaps some of the differences in policy decisions you're seeing because England lags behind and doesn't yet have the socio-economic duty active. Thank you very much for sharing. What next? I will now share both from academic and practitioner experience a bit more about the socio-economic duty itself. Over the last 2 years, the primary clause of this duty is just 47 words. And I can say those 47 words have taken over my life. I'm sure many will relate to that experience because I really see the potential, and I've been an advocate for them for 15 years, trying to get them off the page of the statute books and into action and practice. So for the last 2 years, I've been conducting a critical piece of research using interpretive policy analysis of the dormant status of the duty in England. So if anyone's interested in hearing a bit more about that participatory research, feel free to ask me some questions later. But I'm primarily here to talk from a practitioner perspective to share the detail of the law, its meaning, and how we can all contribute to the call for evidence. And I'm going to highlight some of the talking points that we are going to be putting in our Equality Trust response to the consultation, and that might be interesting for you to also comment upon. And I've also shared a few links in the chat there with some useful links to more information about the duty, some useful case studies, and it's great to have my colleague Helen from Just Fair here, who've done some great work gathering case studies of it in action that bring it to life. And also our friends at Resolve Poverty and Just Fair have a great report looking at voluntary adoption. So if you haven't already checked out, if you live in England and you want to know if your local council or other authorities have voluntarily adopted this duty yet, you can get on their case. I've campaigned to get my local council to voluntarily adopt and not wait for the formal commencement in England, so that might be worth checking out there. So I'm going to share screen, and we will share all of these slides with you for reference after today as well, so you will have those available. So time to commence the socio-economic duty and a chance to contribute to the call for evidence. So a little bit about the Equality Trust, building on, as Richard shared with us earlier, the fantastic work by Richard and Kate on the spirit level. The charity was then founded in 2009 with the mission to dismantle inequalities of income, wealth and power. And we've continued to build upon the work and evidence base of a spirit level with various reports, campaigns and research over the years since then, more recently with the Billionaire Britain report. And my colleague Darrow, who's on the call today, shared some fantastic analysis of the rich list and the concentrations of wealth that have increased rather than being shared more equally in the last 15 years. In terms of the socio-economic duty, the Equality Trust has been active in various campaigns calling upon successive governments to activate the duty, including in the campaign Alliance One for Equality, which you can find out about on our website, and the Make Equality Real campaign facilitated by the General Federation of Trade Unions. And I think that speaks volumes that trade unions, charities and institutes are coming together and calling for effective implementation of this duty. We also run various place-based projects in England with local authorities who want to explore voluntary adoption of this duty as good practice, and we are facilitating community-led and co-production techniques and participatory methods to ensure that the voices of lived experience are at the forefront in influencing policy and how this duty is put into practice. We also sit on various socio-economic duty or SED advisory groups, including to the Cabinet Office team who are working on this implementation of this duty, and we are the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Poverty and Inequality. So the duty fits very much with all this wider work that we are doing. So the socio-economic duty really poses this wider question, what if? And I like a what if question because it invites us to consider the alternative that's possible for us to create, very much inspired by books like The Spirit Level here. You know, what if reducing poverty and socio-economic inequalities was put at the heart of all big policy decisions by all national governments and at the local authority level? And that's really what the socio-economic duty is all about. So what is the duty? A bit of background. So in 2009 to 2010, there was emerging research and some key public reports highlighting the socio-economic inequalities in the UK and their harsh consequences for health, life opportunities, quality and length of life, and of course for wider society. As Richard has shared, The Spirit Level was one that was particularly informing the discourse at this time. Likewise, the Marmot Review, which I'm sure is on many people's radar, was such a watershed moment as well of making that link between health and wealth in this public report commissioned by the government. So again, that was very much influencing the Labour government in charge at that time. And a report that was commissioned by Hills, an anatomy of economic inequality in the UK. So these are some of those really key pieces of research that are really informing the government's thinking on tackling these issues at the time. And these collectively led to informing the Discrimination Law Review and the Green Paper, which then led to a single Equality Act in 2010, bringing all the prior separate pieces of equality law we had before, but also introducing something we'd never had before to come alongside all the other areas. And not only was the socio-economic dimension added, it was the very first paragraph of the legislation. It is Section 1 of the Equality Act of 2010. And it requires that all governments and specific local authorities such as councils, when making their strategic decisions like setting policy and budgets, must give due consideration about how to deliver them, and this is directly from the law, in a way that is designed to reduce the inequalities of outcome which result from socio-economic disadvantage. And here at the Equality Trust, we're excited about a particular few things about that, because it was quite trailblazing that this is the closest the country has ever come to acknowledging these issues actually exist, that there are inequalities of outcome as stated there. Also, secondly, that those are not issues to be blamed in framings of deficit narratives, as other speakers have mentioned today, and stigmatizing and individualized blaming for people or poor misfortune charitable narratives, but actually placing the scrutiny instead of on individuals facing hardship, moving that scrutiny to systemic root causes through systemic strategy and policy decisions. And that was quite a refreshing acknowledgement, really, in the design of this law. However, in 2010, just after that law was passed through Parliament, its fate changed, but because before a start date was set for it, the general election occurred and the coalition government led by the Conservatives publicly announced that they would be abandoning the duty. The words, in fact, were, "We are scrapping the duty." And therefore it didn't get commenced in England. However, it was never repealed. There was no public debate or parliamentary debate about repealing it. It was just simply neglected. Professor Sandy Fredman, who's a professor of law at Oxford University, put it deliciously as constitutionally dubious to have such a law pass through our democracy, but then abandoned without further public debate and not much scrutiny either. However, it remains on the statute book, so we see Scotland commencing in 2018 and Wales, as Dave was sharing the experience, enacted the duty in 2021, but England and cross Great Britain policy making still lagging behind. And just useful to note that Northern Ireland has a separate distinct equality legislation framework, so I won't speak to that today, as the duty won't apply there. However, with the Labour government now back in power and following up on their manifesto pledge to revive this socio-economic duty, work on that has now begun. So we have the public consultation currently open until the end of June, and we're expecting activation of the duty in 2026. So you might want to add your comments about the urgency of timescale in your response to the call for evidence. And in its favour, I think, is over 40 councils in England have already voluntarily adopted this duty as good practice. And so we have some examples of how it can actually work where it is adopted already. And so I was thinking about all the different kinds of poverty, some popping up on the screen here, some have already been spoken about today, you know, food poverty, furniture poverty, period poverty, hygiene poverty, pension poverty, care leaver poverty, even funeral poverty at the end of life, being able to afford to honour our loved ones' wishes. And we probably all see in our local communities various local authorities and charities trying to respond to these crises and help people through. However, what I like about this socio-economic duty is it's more preventative and proactive. And instead of looking at charitable sticking plasters to respond to these crises, it instead says, as policymakers and as a society, how can we design out these needs through good policy design to begin with? And that's going to be hard to achieve without co-production, as Jerry mentioned in the chat, which we see as a vital part of bringing the duty to life. There is lots of support for the duty, so you might want to also draw on this in your response to the call for evidence. 2 polls here finding good public support, 57% supporting commencement of the duty, and the Royal College of Physicians finding 78% of the public participants agreed that all parts of government should have to consider the impact of their policies on those who are less well off. These are just some of the other organisations that we're working alongside who have been doing work in this space, calling for effective activation of this duty and developing case study research where it has been adopted either through law in Scotland and Wales or voluntarily in England. Also, to add to the compelling case that it's overripe for commencement, many of us may have seen the scathing report from the United Nations Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights in the UK, which in repeated reports over the last 15 years has criticised successive governments for failing to fully commence this duty and described austerity policies as systemic immiseration and a violation of the people's rights. I don't think I've heard such spicy language from them about the UK government previously in my lifetime, but let me know if you're aware of any other examples. So a few success stories that we can draw upon and share from where the duty has been adopted and how it can be a useful tool. So in Scotland and Wales, the duty has informed the discourse around child poverty work. It's also been part of the discourse around universal free school meals for primary pupils, which now has been rolled out in Scotland and Wales. I know that the national education unions have been campaigning for this in England as well, and they think if the socio-economic duty was active in Westminster, that could be very helpful to that campaign success. Also in Wales, as Dave mentioned, some examples of addressing the gap in access to and uptake of health services. There's evidence that considering this duty, that pause for thought about delivering strategic healthcare prompted consultation and reviewing of data to see where there were barriers to access and uptake of healthcare, and targeted intervention was then put in place to change it. And the sick pay for care workers exposed to COVID-19, as Dave shared. One from voluntary adoption here in England is the Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service have voluntarily adopted the duty, and this prompted them to review their recruitment strategy and feedback from people who are potential recruits to be firefighters in their community but from poorer homes. So they couldn't afford driving lessons, and if anyone's seen the cost, you can understand why, and the cost of taking a driving test, which was one of the requirements to become a firefighter. This lens of analysis through the socio-economic duty prompted a change. So that requirement has now been removed. The fire service has its own in-house driving school, so it can train talented recruits, and has launched a bursary to help people with those costs of driving lessons. We have some quantifiable outcomes there. So this led to 195 additional firefighters in 2022, and 48% of those recruits were from the 10% most deprived areas. And touching on the intersectionality point, which Lee was mentioning earlier, when you do work that's good for tackling socio-economic disadvantage, there's often intersectional wider inequality benefits, and more women and more racialised candidates also benefited from this policy, so more diverse talent recruited to serve as firefighters. In terms of voluntary adoption across England, more than 40 local authorities have signed up so far, and most of them have added the socio-economic dimension to their existing wider equality impact assessments of their policies, where they review impact, for example, on race, disability, and so on. Now, this isn't specifically required by the duty, but it's a good example of how the duty just naturally prompts and sparks good practice, and it makes sense to add it to the existing impact assessments and reports to councillors. Most have also then been prompted to deliver staff training, which is improved use of data to inform policy decisions and better community involvement to understand the lived experience. That motto there highlighted, listen to those who live it. I always have this mantra in my training for policymakers in this area. I think we should get it on t-shirts. Listen to those who live it. That co-production, poverty truth commissions, participatory approaches, participatory budgeting. The duty is a great opportunity to spark more participatory democratic processes at both national and local political levels. And it hasn't just been approaches and efforts, it has led to policy change outcomes. For example, where the duty has been adopted, councils have committed to things like the living wage across their workforce and across their supply chain workforce too. There's been examples of changes to the way that care leaver grants are issued, and challenging practices such as the automatic removal of carpets or flooring from social housing in between tenancies, even if they're perfectly decent carpets or flooring, adding cost to the next tenant. And these are the kinds of things that sort of just knee-jerk reactions and to things like COVID-19, or worry about, things like passing on poor quality carpets, but actually terrible for sustainability, and lots of good quality carpet just being wasted and cost inflicted on already marginalised tenants. But unless we listen to the people who live it, we wouldn't know that these are issues that are actually the human impact of the policies. So the call for evidence, I've put the four key questions, well, 3 key questions, really. The first one's just a yes, no, in the chat there. And there's a link here to the equality law call for evidence. This is a wider call for evidence on all areas of equality legislation which are being proposed, though today's event just focuses in on the section that's about the socio-economic duty. So you can fill in the consultation online via the government survey, or you can submit via email if you prefer to submit a paper that way. If you do the online survey, that first of the 4 questions on the duty is number 48. And if you click no, it's one of those things where computer says no and the survey ends. So you need to click yes in order to continue the survey to the 3 questions that follow, which I think are really useful open questions for us to put forward our research and our evidence of what will make effective implementation. So we'll keep those in the chat to refer to when you might want to ask questions and share thoughts about those. So there is a 1,000 word limit per question that we have there to put forward our suggestions and findings from research. And I'm mindful of capacity, at times it's hard for everyone to complete their own response. So you can also collaborate and get together with others in your institution or partnerships and networks. And our Coalition One for Equality are working on a template or a potential to co-sign our response, if that's helpful, to pool efforts. So the potential of the duty is to address crises of poverty and its intersectional inequalities. It also takes a baton ball away from the rising populist and far right to divide us if no one's got anyone to blame because life isn't good. If life is good and everyone can afford to live, there's no one to blame for bad circumstances, particularly to wrongly blame. We can reduce policies that cause social harm, and we can ask the question, who gets to shape public policy? So a couple of talking points, and I'll put these in the chat so that perhaps then we have more time for people to ask questions and share thoughts on these. Some of the things our Equality Trust response will cover will be expanding a list of public authorities covered in the duty. It's quite a limited list of government departments, councils and police and crime commissioners. I would like to see that widened to include NHS, schools and other authorities. Co-production is key in terms of amplifying the voices of lived experience, advocates and community groups in this work. We want to see really good statutory guidance with clear definitions and training for the public as well as public sector agencies. We want to address those intersectional issues. And we want to see enabling steps like funding, resources and ways to share good practices across the network of policymakers who will be duty bearers. Monitoring and enforcement is important. The Make Equality Real Commission is calling for an independent commission with voices of charities, trade union equality reps, and voices of lived experience to co-evaluate. And of course, the Equality and Human Rights Commission is likely to have watchdog powers too. We want to see helpful data and research to inform policymakers. Local authorities have stretched capacity, so I think there's a role for universities and academia to partner here and share research and partner up with social research departments who will have such valuable data to help with this. And we want to see universal application of this duty without any exceptions. There is currently an exception in this duty, a legacy from back when it was written in 2010, which excludes people subject to immigration control, for example, no recourse to public funds. So we suggest that shouldn't be commenced along the rest of the duty and should be relegated to the dustbin of unequal rights history. You might also wish to add your evidence on that and call for universal coverage too. And finally, think about the start date. Is that we're looking at 2026. We're hearing late summer, autumn next year, but you might want to add your thoughts about whether that's timely enough for the crises we're facing. And how do we future-proof this duty, reflecting on its prior non-commencement and possible changes of government in the future? How do we build in non-regression protection from rights rollbacks? So I hope that's a helpful quick look at the socio-economic duty and some of the thoughts you might want to add to on the call for evidence. And I'll pass back to Lee, who's kindly going to chair a Q&A. Thank you.